Hello and welcome back to the High Speed Snail Channel. This is another episode of Tales from the Roundhouse. Today's question comes from an individual going, okay, who doesn't make a good railroader? Well, simple questions don't often have simple answers, especially one like this. There's different personality traits that are important to different roles within the railroad. Well, people thinking of railroad or a railroad museum typically think of the operating crew, engineer, fireman, brakeman, conductor, things of that nature. But not everybody's suited to every task. There are certain personality traits that are dominant in individuals and certain personality traits that are required by certain tasks. And that's not to say that an individual that isn't very much a people person can't be a conductor, but they might be more at home in the office filing FRA paperwork than interacting with people asking a whole bunch of questions. Equally, somebody that's wanting to do paperwork, that's important too. You don't have to be the front-facing individual in a museum, and it takes certain traits and certain habits to be able to do that well. So we'll go through some of the different character traits of different tasks, and this is not to say that an individual can't do them that doesn't possess any or all the traits. It's just they'll have more difficulty doing that job. Primarily because, well, that's just how they're wired. That's how they're suited. So we'll go through some of them. One of the first things people think about when they think of railroading is the operation crew. Fireman, engineer, conductor, brakeman, that sort of thing. And each of the different tasks have different needs and responsibilities. Naturally, that's why they're different. If you can lump them all together, then you'd have single operator operations, which I'm sure many mainline railroads would appreciate these days, but you need multiple people because then you have different sets of eyes looking at different things and paying attention, sometimes better than others. So for a conductor, especially if you're talking Heritage Railroad, Railroad Museum, things of that nature, you want somebody that understands how the train equipment works and a fair bit of human nature and tends to be a people person because a brakeman or conductor actually being in the passenger cars, car attendant, things like that. I'll kind of lump that in with brakeman because just reality. But if you're going to be interacting with the public or interacting with the passengers, you have to answer the same question 300 times in a month, in a day. Things like that. Um, what does this do? What does that do? How does this work? Does the engineer fireman do this or that? All these diverse and often complicated questions deserve a reasonable answer. And so you have to be the kind of person that does not mind answering the same thing over and over and over again. You'll develop your own personal patterns of how to respond to the simplistic question or if they want a more complicated answer. So you have to be able to work with the public on that one. You can't really be isolated and quiet. I mean, you can, but again, there's a lot more trouble to it when a person of that personality type tries to take on the role of a conductor or brakeman or car attendant, things like that. That tends to put more stress on the person and makes them a bit more awkward sometimes or surly, or their interaction with the public is not optimal. And for a museum or for an enterprise that's trying to garner income from the public, that's not a wonderful position to be in for the person and not a wonderful position to be in for the company. So that's why sometimes museums will place somebody in a position for preferential treatment because they know they can do the job, and other people get irked by that. Well, welcome to the diversity of humanity. I'm not perfect at everything, neither is anybody else. So there you go. Um, for a brakeman, you have to be more attendant to what the train is doing than the conductor. The conductor is just in charge of the whole ball of wax and has to deal with the problematic passengers. A brakeman can go, I need to do this, I need to do that, and deal with their particular task of dealing with the operation of the train as a vehicle. That means inspecting the brakes, hearing if something's going wrong on one of the trucks, paying attention to what the engineer and firemen are doing, of how the train is reacting to whatever they're doing with the locomotive, things like this. And so they can kind of shrug off some of the responsibility of the humanity to the conductor and focus on their their tasks. Now, each museum tends to train a brakeman differently. There's generalized concepts. I won't get into that now. Um, but there's also specific ones to that location, to that museum. We do it this way. We want that. Do things in this order, whatever. It becomes habit. So a lot of places will overlook variance in protocol so long as everything gets done. Because if a person's used to doing X, Y, and Z in a very specific order, and it accomplishes the same task of doing Z, X, Y, most museums are fine with it. Sometimes it is protocol based, sometimes it's not. It depends on the type of equipment, the type of person, the type of operation, a whole bunch of things. So volunteer based museums tend to be a lot more forgiving as far as what the process is, so long as the result is the same. Now, if you're talking an actual corporation, then the process is everything. The process has to be documented, has to be verified, has to be uh, um, permitted, and things like that. Varies by state, but this is how the reality is. As far as fireman and engineer, well, an engineer usually has to know how to fire first. Now, a lot of times, especially with volunteer organizations, you get older people that, well, take me for instance. I'm not going to be able to fire for hours and hours and hours at a time just because the physical demand is a little bit beyond my capacity anymore. Depends on the size of the locomotive, of course, but I'm not going to be firing on a mainline locomotive, not hand firing anyway. Um, Operationally, I know how the locomotive is put together. I know what to do if a rod bearing starts, complaining, or if I'm paying attention to clanks and bumps and things like that. And anybody that's worked with me has seen me actually lean out the side of the cab and go, be pondering something, just an odd sound at an odd time, and trying to figure out what it was. If it's something important, if it's not, yada yada. So an engineer has a lot more responsibility of the actual operation of the locomotive, but he has to be able to keep track of firing too, to figure out if the fireman is doing his job properly or not. And the fireman's job, that varies widely. Size of locomotive, what kind of train you're running, what kind of grades the right-of-way has. Um, Oil-fired, coal-fired, wood-fired, a keyhole firebox versus a broad overframe firebox. Things like this. Firing patterns, the kind of coal that you have. Everything goes together to make a fireman's job a headache. Um, and it's all individualistic to every single locomotive. I mean, even if you're used to, say, Stoker-fired LS&I engines, which there are a number of out there, uh, each locomotive's operation is going to be different because each locomotive's maintenance is going to be different, and since they're spread out over the U.S., each locomotive's expectations for running the train is going to be different. Each railroad is going to have different topography, different aspects, different things you're going to have to pay attention to. And so, even though they're built almost identically coming out of the shops, even sister locomotives are going to be operationally different just because that's reality. So fireman has to be diligent, has to be reliable. The engineer and conductor have to know this man can do the job throughout the whole route, and do it responsibly and not muck things up accidentally, and hopefully not intentionally. Um, and he has to pay attention to a whole number of things at once. He has to pay attention to the fire, no matter what you're firing or how you're firing. He has to pay attention to the water level in the boiler. Has to understand the route's topography to know where the water level should be higher, where the water level should be lower with respect to the sight glass. He has to watch out the left side of the cab for the engineer on crossings and things like that, because lo and behold, you can only see out from one side of a steam locomotive. He has to, when the bell needs to be rung, somebody has to do that, unless you have an air ringer, which helps, but still somebody has to turn on, turn off. Has to pay attention to things happening out that side of the train. Pay attention to the train behind on the fireman's side, on the right and on the left-hand side. Engineer has to pay attention to the train behind on the right-hand side, because you can only see that. Now, if you're talking about, are the cars on the track? Okay, both sides can see the same thing. But if somebody's hanging out a window on the fireman's side, trying to get photos of the engine or anything like that, that's a little bit of a problem. So things like that, and that's something the engineer can't see. There's various aspects to each position, and locomotive crew, you have to have a degree of diligence, especially the engineer, because basically the welfare of everybody traveling behind me is in his hands. Um, he has to be the one that even though the conductor's in charge of the train entire, he's the one that makes it go, makes it slow, or can make it a disaster, frankly speaking. The conductor is pretty much just along for the ride and to pretty much do the paperwork for the train, which is another thing that conductors have to do. Brakemen really don't. Firemen and locomotive engineers, there's some paperwork that's involved with it. It depends on the location, depends on the railroad, and depends on a whole lot of things. So again, you have to. There's aspects that you have to do with every given job. I'm going to stop this here, and I'll go on to some other positions within a railroad museum that most people don't really think of, and that require sometimes specialized behavior. See you in a bit.